Welcome to another STOBETTER investigation, or as we like to call it, Mathbusters, where the STOBETTER team uses math and evidence to approach a question about STO's space belts. The question before us is a classic one. To torp or not to torp? That is the question. Whether 'tis higher in the deeps to slot and unleash torpedoes, or to use only do, and by doing, skip them. To torp, one torp to support fall, for in that one torp launcher lies strength to unlock CFP, and perhaps Maelstroms too. For those of you who don't follow along, or prefer your Shakespeare in the original Klingon, the question is this: what is the worth of a torpedo on an energy build, something that we call one-torping? This is not a black and white yes or no question, and lives very much in the "it depends" space where many such questions reside. That's why we do the investigations. If it was a simple answer, we wouldn't need to do all the math. So this makes the next question, it depends on what? There are 6 main considerations here. First, what is your primary firing mode? In particular, is this a fire at will or reroute reserves to weapons build? The second question is, what is your budget for starship traits and consoles? The third question is, how much do your other weapons benefit from having higher average weapons power, due to the torpedo not draining weapons power, or the set bonus that you get from a good torpedo? Question 4, what is the impact of concentrate firepower? Question 5, theme or personal preference? And question 6, are Maelstrom torpedoes in play? Let's dive in. All energy modes strongly benefit from an extension starship trait, which increases the uptime of the firing mode buff from its base duration of 10 seconds. Fire at Will has 5 extension traits. Redirecting arrays from a T6 Seastore ship, the Tucker, increases the duration up to 15 seconds total when taking damage. Precision multi-targeting from a T6 lockbox ship, the Joragumo, grants a copy of Fire at Will when using a target subsystem ability. In practicality, this limits it basically to science carriers or science ships that have innate subsystem targeting. Entwined Tactical Matrices is also from a Seastore ship from the Gagarin or the Kuch, and it grants a copy of Fire at Will and Scatter Volley 1 whenever using Torpedo Spread. This has to be cycled every 10 seconds with your main copy of Fire at Will. Starfleet Hopefuls is from a promo ship, the Lamar, and it extends Fire at Will by 10 seconds when activating Fire at Will 1. And Breen's Free Fire is from another promo ship, the Breen Yod Thought, and it extends Fire at Will by 5 seconds as well. Redirecting arrays only works reliably on tanks or ships with pilot seating for flyer apart, since it requires taking damage to trigger its condition. Precision multi-targeting is expensive and efficient only in a few subclasses of ships. Still doesn't really get you additional uptime. Not ideal. Starfleet Hopefuls is also expensive and requires you to use Fire at Will 1 rather than rank 2 or 3. Breen's Free Fire is the newest trait, it has the most efficacy, but is also extremely expensive and a per character unlock. All that to say, if you're using Entwined Tactical Matrices, which is the cheapest and most versatile fall extension trait, it also applies to other types of builds like exotic and kinetic builds, you're still going to need Torpedo. If you use Torpedo Spread without firing a Torpedo Spread cannot be activated again for 30 seconds. Thus, we need to have a Torpedo slotted and firing to use Entwined Tactical Matrices. Therefore, any Fire at Will build using ETM needs a Torpedo. Reroute reserves to weapons is a niche single-target firing mode exclusive to pilot ships, and is really only worth running on commander pilot ships because both ranks 2 and 3 are on the commander seat. There are only 26 commander pilot ships once you condense cross-faction and fleet variants. Most of them have an experimental weapon slot, and some of them have fewer than 7 weapons. However, even 6 or 7 weapons can be a lot of power drain, especially in the current haste-centric meta. Under reroute reserves to weapons, your weapons drain engine power instead of weapon power, and they don't return the power back at the end of the firing cycle, unlike normal weapons fire. This drains a lot of engine power as you fire, and weapon power cost reductions do not work to reduce the drain. Furthermore, if your engines go offline because of the power running out, you lose the buff. This is a very niche firing mode, not a lot of people use it, so I'm not going to go into great detail on this build case. But one of the ways to reduce the engine power drain and thus keep your reroute reserves to weapons built up is to use a torpedo, combined with a useful set bonus to bring some extra damage to your weapons. Our second question is about budget. The use case for a torpedo on an energy build scales directly with budget, because there are a number of specific set bonuses and consoles that play into utilization of torpedoes. At the lower end, these are going to be a net benefit to your build. At the higher end, you might find them outclassed. Here are some of the common ones. The Lorca's Ambition 2-piece bonus War Discretion brings 25% critical damage. On some ships, this can be accomplished by running the console and the wide-angle heavy phaser disruptor dual beam bank, but that's not ideal for cannon builds or other energy flavors, and the dual beam bank does not play nicely with exceeded rated limits or reroute reserves to weapons. For all of the scenarios except for the ones where you can use the beam bank, you would use the Dark Matter Torpedo for the second piece. And that particular torpedo brings extra damage from Chemosite as well due to every tick of the dot that's applied when the torpedo crits, proccing Chemosite. Looking at my averages, Chemosite gains 50 to 70% more DPS when used with the Dark Matter Torpedo. If you're using a Polaron build, the Morphogenic 3-piece is quite powerful and requires an energy torpedo. The Quantum Phase Torpedo has a 2-piece with a console typically, or a beam, doubles the shield drain on the torpedo and adds 15 global accuracy. The torpedo itself is quite strong, specifically on phaser builds with beams or surgical strikes, where you can already get the Lorca's Ambition bonus from the console and dual beam bank and still get this bonus on top of it. We'll talk about concentrated firepower more below, but if you're planning around it, the Counter Command Ordnance set is 7.5% bonus phaser, disruptor, plasma, or Tetran damage, which is a little something. Torpedo and turret are common choices here. Let's talk supercharged weapons. This is one of the better traits for an energy weapon build. You can see the stats here. It requires a torpedo with a firing mode to adequately stack and fire, since it stacks up to 3 times, and waiting for a single torpedo launch to stack it is not good. If we're expecting a build to prioritize emergency weapon cycle for the haste and the power cost reduction, and an extension trait of choice, if we assume that those slots are kind of reserved, then there are 5 other slots you'd need to fill on a T6X2 ship. Supercharged weapons, in general, is outclassed only by this list over here. You know what most of those have in common? They're expensive. Largely through the event campaign, I have access to 4 promo ships and 8 lockbox ships, and even I don't have all the ones in that list, certainly not on one character. So if supercharged weapons is one of your top 7 traits for an energy weapon build, you should definitely consider it because it is very strong. Also, don't forget that certain on-a-hit effects like complex plasma fires and broadside beam support benefit heavily from having more energy weapons and having them fire faster, so if those are in play, maybe there's an argument that slants away from supercharged weapons. Energy weapon damage scales off of weapon power. Each weapon drains weapon power during a firing cycle. Since the torpedo does not drain power, using a torpedo in place of an energy weapon will increase the average weapon power at which your other energy weapons fire. How much is this benefit? Since this is very difficult to test without gobs of data, I'm going to use our Trinity DPS calculator for this. Trinity does a good job of modeling various considerations, variables, and whatnot. I took a few builds and modeled the energy damage gain or loss of replacing the torpedo with a single Mark I weapon of the same type, i.e. a beam or a cannon, but non-matching flavor in order to remove that weapon's damage. So the weapon will still draw power, and we'll see the other energy weapons DPS go down based solely on the change in power draw. We'll also check what the loss is for mixing in beam overload, which increases weapon power cost, and weapon system efficiency, which lowers it, as applicable. We'll also replace supercharged weapons and a set bonus if it's applicable at that budget tier. If we look across all the builds and budgets after all crunching the numbers, we can come up with some averages for the loss. The average DPS loss from additional energy drain was about 1%. Average DPS loss from losing a valuable set bonus, typically the Lorca's Ambition 2-piece, about 3%. Average DPS loss from switching supercharged weapons out for a different trait without breaking the budget at that tier was 4.3%. And if you're curious about how we do budget tiers, check out our site. We have a build costs guide that goes into how we classify them. If you add all those up, it leads to 8.39%. In the interest of simpling it down to a general guideline, I'm going to use the nice round number of 10% for how close the torpedo needs to be in DPS at most build ranges to another 4 weapon to justify its inclusion. At the very highest end of builds, that number is probably more like 5%, due to supercharged weapons no longer making your top 7 traits, and on-hit effects like complex plasma fires having increased prevalence. The analysis we did above suggests that unless the torpedo is required for reasons we have already covered, our torpedo effects have to be within 10% of other forward weapons to not be a DPS loss. Here's a table of a representative sample of my 1-torp builds, their firing mode, budget, energy flavor, torpedo DPS, concentrate firepower DPS, generic forward weapon DPS, chemosite DPS, and the part we really care about, ultimately, is the torpedo value added or not? I will also point out that if you want the exact answer for your personal build, the answer lies in either flying and parsing your build with both setups, or modeling your build in Trinity knowing that it doesn't quite calculate every single piece. Flying solo, if you can, will give you more repeatable results. A brief refresher on Concentrate Firepower. It's a command specialization ability that does 3 things for a torpedo. It applies extra torpedo damage directly to hull, it resets torpedo cooldowns, and periodically grants torpedo high yield. The drastic decrease in time between the high yield torpedoes and the fact that lower ranks override upper ranks of the buff is why the general wisdom on Concentrate Firepower is to slot it at rank 3 or not at all. And there are 2 scenarios at play where you could consider Concentrate Firepower. The first is on a ship with Lieutenant Commander command, and the second is a supported environment where you might not have it, but the other 3 to 4 people on the team supporting you are casting it for you and adding to your overall damage. Certain torpedoes, namely the Delphic Distortion, which gets an extra torpedo and thus an extra roll on its debuff to resistance, and the Enhanced Biomolecular Torpedo, which gets an AoE non-destructible high yield torpedo. They have extra bonus effects on their high yield, so those free high yields represent a significant DPS increase. That brings us to our 5th question. Theme. The most important part of STO is having fun, and in the shows, most hero ships had some form of energy weapon, like a beam, and torpedoes, so there are plentiful examples of having both weapon systems in canon. If that's important to you, any potential DPS loss from a torpedo is not an important consideration in your build, or is at least secondary. And if I can paraphrase Worf in Picard Season 3, torps are fun, so I'm going to use them even on builds that might do better with all energy weapons. The last question has to do with Maelstrom torpedoes. I personally do not use these. I only have access to the trifluoride torpedo. I have seen other people post ridiculous numbers with them, mostly in specific scenarios, but I haven't had as much success myself. If you're willing to make them work and you're building around that specific content, I think that's typically an ISE thing, then there's certainly a consideration. I don't find them useful for supercharged weapon stacking since the reload time is simply too long without some dedicated team-wide Concentrate Firepower usage, and arguably that's a bug. So I use supercharged weapons a lot, and so I don't use Maelstrom. Your mileage may vary on that one. Torpedoes on energy builds equals bad is a gross overgeneralization completely devoid of nuance per all the analysis above. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. And the areas where it is true are generally not the same place that the person who's asking the question is coming from. So, let's refresh. Fire oil builds using entwined tactical matrices and reroute reserved weapons builds will always need a torpedo. Builds using Concentrate Firepower 3 generally benefit from a torpedo, particularly a strong performer under high yield. As a guideline, the torpedo's contribution to damage needs to be within 10% of another forward energy weapon to justify its inclusion, if you're using supercharged weapons, and within 5% if you're not using supercharged weapons, strictly by the numbers. Otherwise, do some comparison testing. It's good for you. Whether you use a good torpedo on your energy build or not, for all but the about 100 people who chase the very top of the infected space ladder, the difference is going to be fairly small. I have builds where the math shows the torpedo, at least for that parse, is mathematically suboptimal. That build is doing over 1 million DPS, so am I really noticing the loss? Bottom line, use what works for you and is fun for you. But if you were curious about the mathematical answer, that's why all this is here, and that's why we're here. Thanks for tuning in. Captain, if this breakdown helped you in your quest to play STO better, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. The link to the specific build used for this tutorial is in the description. For more guides and builds, check us out at www.stobetter.com.